me go to Hasina on the other end. Is this okay? Just check that, Hasina. Yeah. Thanks. So, Hasina, welcome and thanks for joining us today. Um, Specifically, I would like you to address this issue of how and what does the data that you work with say on the situation as regards the Muslim woman or the vulnerable woman. Your network works across the gender divide. And if you can tell us how you use that data, what kind of data, and how it will help this community.
First and foremost, thank you, Sahida ma'am, for inviting me here. It's a privilege. I think in a lighter note, this panel, when we talk about gender inclusion, there's one woman and 4 men, which is quite interesting. But let me just introduce myself. You look at my name as Hasina and you look at my surname as Kharbhih. I represent a matrilineal society where the lineage is through the mother, and I still have the background of being a Muslim. So I think that's completely, we are talking about gender inclusion. I grew up in a family which gender is never a discussion because there's always equality as we grow up. The lineage of property is through the youngest, which I'm the youngest because I happen to be the caretaker of the family. So I grew up in the northeast of India, where we have a lot of Muslim communities as well. No doubt, whether we call them minorities or we call them, non-minorities is a question of debate. Because even among the indigenous population of the world, a lot of indigenous population lives in the Northeast, which are still minorities, if you want to use the word minority in the economic sense. So I really wanted to bring this enhancement that growing up in a setup like the region I represent, where we have small group of indigenous populations, which till today, in terms of data, is still a big question mark. Yeah. We don't have the real data of the kind of tribes and sub-tribes. Even the UN have declared, the categories of indigenous populations, but still, we have common language as English in many levels so that we are able to communicate to one another. So I come from that perspective. And the second part is here we are discussing about gender inclusion from the context of Muslim women. We have a lot of Muslim women in that region as well. When we're looking at Manipur, we're looking at Assam, we're looking at Meghalaya. I come from the state of Meghalaya. Now, I come from a matrilineal where I stand for growing up as a young woman that what my brother gets and what I get is the same. We never had a disparity. So I think contextually for me, if we are talking about, I just want to open up before I get to the answer to the question, is that it's very cultural centric, right? I mean, religion is very personal. And cultural is how we identify ourselves and the region we come from. So I think the moment we start looking at it from that perspective, we'll not we'll not put ourselves in a compartment, right? Muslim, Hindu, and all of that. That's how I stand for. I know it's a debatable, but I grew up in a forum like that. I grew up that way. So in Shillong, Eid and mosque and everything, this intermingling is so common, so different, right? So we don't have, of course, we have our own sets of issues as well in the Northeast, but comparingly to the discussion that we're having today, it's something that I think we need to look at the culture from where we come from. Because I didn't grow up that I have to wear a hijab, or I didn't grow up that I have to wear, certain clothing. I grew up that we belong to a matrilineal and our culture is very important. Our religion is very personal in the house. So I think that is something the century today or the millennials today will have to relook it more broader and break these kind of norms. Coming back to the data, to the question that you've asked, 32 years of my work, I work with the issue of migration and human trafficking, where the debatable issues of data has become a global phenomena that who have the data for human trafficking and whose data is correct. And when we are talking about data for human trafficking, we are talking about data of exploitation that is taking place. In relation to the work of 25 years, our organization set up an innovation called the Impulse model that really went on deeper to understand, can we come out with a centralized data that actually help in working with the system, ensuring that the system is enforcing and providing support, to address human trafficking from the sense of a human right perspective, from the sense of economic, because it's always the marginalized and the minorities and the people who are displaced and the people who are losing their economic, whether to man-made disaster or, to the natural disaster that leads them, to be migrating unsafely. So in 2012, we created Impulse Case Management System, a centralized data that allows the anti-human trafficking units, which is the law enforcement, to work with us in ensuring that we have a centralized data that help us comprehend responses to address human trafficking in the lens of the law, which is constitutional, and also looking in terms of the protocol that a country is responsible to address human trafficking. There, I think the first big question was, do we put the issue of religion in the box, right? Do we put religion, like whether you're Christian, whether you're Muslim, and all of that? There was a roundtable debate before we developed the technology platform that religion should not actually brings, as a center stage, but it has to be the context of gender and inclusive of all gender. And we work inclusive of all gender. So then the removal of that religion, out of that system came out. Then we started looking much deeper, because if you start looking it from the lens of from a religion perspective, then we lose track of the real human rights that a data can analyze, because we are talking about men, women, children, other gender, age groups, and all of that. So we concentrated non-religious in the way we develop our data management. That data management today handles around 70,000 plus of cases of human trafficking, cut across labor, sexual exploitation, and others. We see that inclusively, vulnerability is not from the context whether you're a Muslim or you're non-Muslim. It's always whether you are a woman or a child, where the demand in the markets is higher because of your economic reason. And then we realized that from the northeast of India, in Southeast Asia, we have become a source, a transit, and also a destination as far as we are today, because we're looking at Indo-Myanmar situation at the moment. We work with displaced people, which is majority. We're looking at the situation of the economic of floods that happened in Assam every year. We're having the movement of people. So the way we are looking at data for us, we're looking more about responses at the right time, responses by the law enforcement from the lens of the law that we are entitled, and responses of the constitutional rights that each one of us are supposed to be getting. That's how our data is analyzing. And also ensuring that we are able to give redressal at the highest order. So it depends on how we look at data. I mean, each one of us might have differences. Then we realize that economic reason is a push factor from the way we have analyzed our issues of migration and human trafficking. So then we came up to work in strengthening economic in the region, which is highly vulnerable. And we created another system of data to understand whether the centralized 30,000 women we are working with and the subsequent families, are they being reduced from vulnerability if economic is, higher in terms of giving them livelihood and opportunities? When we analyze it, so what I'm just trying to say, that data is critical and important. If we have to validate policy change, if we have to ensure responses in the right way, if we have to ensure a system change within the system, it's important. But again, data cannot be a totality of centralized, because it's also the debate which subject matter. So for me, I would say data from the subject matter lens is very important, so that you are able to design programs and activities and inclusiveness from all angles, from the right perspective, because we cannot just have one kind of data for the whole country, you know. And then I think sometime there has to be an interlinkages of partnership between the government and the non-profit, because if we don't have that kind of linkages, when we sit across the table, the non-profit will debate with the government, and the government will see your data is not adequately correct. So this is also partnership is an important element. So let me just open with that. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks. And note that the data issue that Hasina Ali points out is an issue that otherwise might not be so relevant. I mean, it is human trafficking is such a big issue in that part of the country that we here do not really worry about it otherwise. Well, what I'll come back to you later on is the other big elephant in that room, which is the data on citizenship, and that's something that again is an issue that concerns all of you so very much, and disproportionately the women in that part of the country, and certainly the Muslim women.